Welcome to another installment of Data Skeptic Animal Intelligence. Today I'm very excited we get to feature parrots amongst other species in the discussion. We're learning about their communication needs and desires and capabilities and things along those lines. Becky, how did you initially get Ilyena on your radar?
A pretty famous study that made the rounds all over news outlets, I want to say a year or so ago. And it was all about different parrots, pet parrots, making video calls, so kind of Skyping one another. And I thought that was really fascinating. And when I looked at all the authors, I eventually found Ilyena, and she does animal computer interaction, which I thought was actually more interesting than the animal cognition aspect because you don't hear about that very often. And that's a pretty difficult design challenge.
Yeah, most user interfaces are truly built for humans. It was interesting to hear some of the challenges she faced. I related pretty heavily to one point she made that anything you put in front of a bird, the bird is likely to destroy eventually, often quite quickly. So, figuring out how to build a bird destruction proof interface presents some novel challenges for sure.
Absolutely. And I think she also discussed trying to make primate proof interfaces and how you even begin to do rapid prototyping if you can't use flimsy materials with your animals. So that was a really interesting problem that she has to deal with.
There's an important bit of science, I think, to be acknowledged in the experiment with the Skype calling birds. In some situations, and they did a proper test control here, they showed because you wouldn't compare the bird enjoying the call to a control where there's no call. Obviously, something novel is novel for novelty's sake. So the control they're comparing against was what if the birds had the option to see a video of another parrot? So a non-interactive, non-real time but also, streaming video. From a naive perspective, the same thing. But it was interesting how they got to look at the way that impacted the bird's decisions. Any other big takeaways from this one?
Yeah, I think the big one for me was using technology to create more choice for captive animals. So, this idea that we can use technology to improve animal welfare or give animals more control over their environment if they're in captive situations. There's a big push for more research on this and how choice actually affects captive animal welfare. A recent meta analysis came out, I think, just a couple weeks ago, and there's not a lot of data. Intuitively, we understand that having more choice and control over your environment, whether you're a human or non-human animal, is probably a good thing, but we need more research on it. Animal computer interaction is a great way to expand that research and improve welfare outcomes. So I think people will find it interesting to think about technology in this way.
Well, let's get right into the interview then.
Look, everybody, data science has been reshaping every industry, and that's not slowing down. All this AI stuff is just going to accelerate it. So whether you want to advance or pivot your career, you should consider the Georgia Tech Scheller College of Business and their 100% online Business Analytics Graduate Certificate program. It'll teach you how to analyze and interpret data. The skills you learn will allow you to succeed anywhere. This online program consists of 4 courses: Business Analytics for Managers, Machine Learning for Business, Business Data Preparation and Visualization, and Analysis of Unstructured Data. It's a flexible program. You can go at your own pace. Those of you who want to hit the gas hard can take 2 courses a semester and graduate within a year. The Business Analytics Graduate Certificate is designed for professionals in any industry who want to become data-savvy leaders or pivot into analytics. It can also be your gateway into a Georgia Tech MBA. So are you ready to become a data-savvy leader? Get the skills necessary to do that. Applications for the Georgia Tech Scheller College of Business Business Analytics Graduate Certificate are open now for spring 2025. Visit techgradcertificates.com to learn more. And don't forget to apply by October 1st. That's the deadline. For more information, head over to techgradcertificates.com.
I'm Ilyena Hersky-Douglas from the University of Glasgow. At Glasgow, I'm a lecturer. I run the Animal-Computer Interaction Research Group. So in the group, we look at how animals can use computers in various different circumstances, from pets in our home to animals in the zoo.
So we've talked on the show to a number of people from the HCI, human-computer interaction world. Is there a lot of overlap, or is ACI, animal-computer interaction, really kind of a siloed area?
There's a huge amount of overlap. I would say animal computer interaction borrows a lot of methods and all the vast experience we have in human computer interaction. We go so in depth and we're so far ahead in how we use technology compared to animals. It also borrows a lot from animal science methods, animal cognition. So it's a blend really of everything around it. In the same way, HDI is really a blend of human cognition and psychology and all that.
And I want to get into some of your specific interests, but speaking maybe for the community first, what are some of the open questions the ACI community is interested in?
So, the ACI community is very much interested in how we can design technology that meets an animal's need. So, in the same way that we look at how people use technology. So, we know, for instance, with mobile phones, how we swipe, how big buttons need to be, how we use VR is coming, all these different trends. We look at so much what humans need in technology. And this is a big question in ACI of what do animals need in technology? And then also, how can animals even use technology? We as humans, traditionally have pressed buttons with our fingers. Animals can also use technology if they have this. So, monkeys, for instance, or larger primates. But then, if we get into more quirky animals, so say if we get into a dolphin, maybe a dolphin uses it through echolocation, or maybe a parrot uses it through its tongue. So, again, innovative ways that we can make interfaces for animals.
Well, in HCI, one popular technique to evaluate whatever you're working on is to do a focus group. You bring some people in, you show them a device, they have an experience, and you then ask them questions. Asking the questions is not always available with animals. How do you get feedback?
Well, you can try. You can get a group of dogs maybe together and ask them something, but I don't think it's going to work so well. You get a feedback in various different ways. So, similar to what we would do if we were in HCI with very young children, we would ask their caregivers or some adults, such as the school teachers or parents. In ACI, you can do exactly the same. You can go to a caregiver, so say, for instance, a pet owner or a zookeeper at a zoo, and ask them to feedback on behalf of their animal. You can also do things where you create technology like what stuff I do, where you allow animals to choose to use or not to use something. So that's another form of sort of gathering sort of their opinions around it. We think about it in humans that we get them to fill in a questionnaire and we say, did you like this, yes or no? But even that simple question of yes or no is quite hard to gather. Are they just doing something to please you? Do they really understand what's going on? When you work with animals, you're forced to you can't even get this. So you're forced to step outside of yourself a little bit and really dig deeper into these questions. So I would say that even in humans, it's not easy to answer.
Well, when you put let's say, a computer in front of a human being, they intuitively know what to do with it. They presumably know how to type or at least know the alphabet. It seems like you're almost starting from scratch with animals. How do you think about designing an interface?
Yeah, I would say with humans, though, also started from scratch, right? Our interfaces originally didn't have mice. We didn't have, we just had all these huge bits of paper that we fed into machines, right? And we've developed the interface solely over to use our eyes and our fingers, now our body, and, all the watches and all these wonderful things. It's exactly the same with animals. We're looking at ways that they can interact with technology originally through their body. A lot of this is done through looking at how animals interact already with their environment, in the same way that a lot of technology we're developing now is looking at how we already interact with our environment, and this aim towards seamless technology in HCI where we don't even know it's there. With animals, it's exactly the same. A lot of times we look at how animals ordinarily bodies are and then developing technology for this. Again, it's kind of hard in this. With humans, we can give them instructions and we can say the technology is on or the technology is off. With animals, we have this complex problem of how does an animal know even what a technology is or it exists there?
When you spoke about designing technology to meet an animal's needs, one inference I take from that is you're not building toys. This isn't something cute that, the parrot mimics or whatever. Could you articulate what some of the needs are that you think the technology can facilitate?
So, to meeting some of their needs, if we go, for example, with parrots, for instance, how a parrot would use a touchscreen would traditionally be with their tongue. So, they reach out and they lick the touchscreen. Their beak isn't conductive and can't really use it. They obviously don't have fingers. So, some work, for instance, we've done to meet their needs is a parrot's tongue is also not wet in the same way that ours is wet. And so, when they're going to look at pressing a screen, They need the button to be a certain bigger size. The screen needs to be quite conductive. They need to have certain features of the screen, such as they do multi-tap because their taps are so infrequently guessed. So in this case, a parrot's need, if we talk about it with a screen, would be all these different factors of needing to be able to multi-touch the button a certain size. They don't pay attention to space, for instance, so there's no point having things that are really far apart or close together. You kind of just need things evenly spaced. So these are the sorts of needs. If we talk about it, needs in terms of like why build technology in the first place altogether, I guess that's another even larger philosophy need. Why do humans need technology altogether could be another one. We come into this conversation a lot when we talk about children, what age is right for children? Why do children need technology? I would say we're really on the cusp of how can technology support animals and what can we get from technology for animals. And so we're sort of answering that question, I think, as we go along a little bit sometimes.
Well, could we zoom in on the work from the Call of the Wild web paper? What were you trying to build for parrots?
In the Call of the Wild web paper, we had previously looked at parrots using video calls to video call other parrots. So parrots are a lot of times left home alone for long periods, or they potentially have not seen another parrot. Some parrots live with another parrot, but potentially in the wild, they live in these huge flocks that they just don't get in captive situations. And so we'd previously built a video call system where we trained parrots to ring a bell and then select a friend's profile on a screen to do video calls. And we did the system with about 20 birds. And what we found was that all parrots who we gave this video call system to would actively engage in the system. So they freely chose to use video calls to each other. They had things like favorite friends and different sorts of things. But it requires a lot from their caregiver to set up the system. You have to be available for your parrot to set up the system. You have to be there to monitor your parrot using the system just in case something goes wrong or they have a fearful reaction. Looking to support parrots long term, I started to wonder, does it really matter if another parrot is live? And so in the Call the Wild web paper, what we did was we modified the system so that parrots could call live parrots, and then it would change to where they were exactly the same system, so ringing a bell and selecting a photo, but instead it was videos of parrots in a call rather than a live call. And we did the system so we could have a look at, do parrots' call behaviors change? Do they make more or less calls? Do they stay in calls longer? Are their motivations, so how quickly they use the system, change? And what we found was that parrots would significantly trigger more calls and stay in the calls for longer when it was a live bird than a pre-recorded one.
Do you have a sense of why that is? What's the interaction they're getting out of it that differs from the video?
Yeah, it's sort of like the golden question, right? Of how does a parrot know that another parrot's online, and why does it matter?
Yeah.
We did a lot of interviews. As I mentioned, we talked to caregivers a lot of the time to try and get deeper into the questions. So we did a lot of interviews with caregivers and asked the caregivers questionnaires. A lot of the caregivers felt that it was the synchronicity of the behaviors. So their parrots would call out and the other parrot wouldn't call out, or do a certain behavior and the other parrot wouldn't do the behavior. And when we look at humans, the synchronicity in conversations plays a huge part into things. So it could also be this. Some owners believe that their parrots didn't like the color of the other parrot, or that they had preferred the original parrot. Some owners believe that the other owners took part. So when the owners are talking to each other, this helps with the parrots. We don't really know. It's really open to so much interpretation, because this was like sort of the first initial study done in this, to what gives away. It could be the beak position, it could be some of the vocalizations, it could be the way that you hold yourself. We don't really know how parrots really understand that another parrot is live.
Well, you can't often say this, at least politely, but you have some of the most beautiful subjects in your research study.
Oh, thank you so much.
Paper here. Quite a good collection of parrots. Did you find that they had any affinity in their preferences, like maybe size, or I don't know if there's a lot of species overlap, but any instinct about what made them develop an affinity for one bird over another?
So we know that in our original study, when we did to live parrots, they did have favorite other parrots to call, but these weren't necessarily parrots of the same size or the same species. And we only had 20 participants. And as you know, being a parrot owner, there are so many different types of parrots, and these range in sizes from extremely tiny to a couple of feet big. I mean, even how you measure a parrot becomes a bit hard. You can't just put a measuring tape from top to the bottom. You have the whole tail to worry about. We didn't have enough participants with the such varied species that parrots are to really find any correlations between what they did. One notable relationship we did notice varied was with two older macaws who had never seen another macaw before and did end up ringing. And after the study ended, they actually still kept ringing each other. They often rang each other after things like a vet visit or when their owners felt it was beneficial. So, other than like individual stories like that, we don't really know if there is a certain preference. When we did initially group parrots together, we did do a little bit of jiggling around of the groups. So, because we had this one very small Firebird parrot that enjoyed screaming in the video call. And we thought another parrot in the call wasn't so impressed, so we moved that parrot to another group. And we thought initially this was maybe distress or something like this. And we spoke with the parrot behavior expert. And it's just how the parrot enjoyed having a video call. So she moved into another group where the other members were okay with this. So I guess it's a bit like humans where you can have a little bit of jiggling around, but we don't really know exactly the ideal formula.
Did the parrots have to be trained at all, or was it an intuitive interface for them?
It was a trained interface. The reason we did a trained interface in this because we wanted to see if, given the choice, a bird would use the system or not in a way that relied on cooperation behavior, which is where they do two sets of behaviors. So to use the system, they had to ring the bell and then select the photo as well. It's because we were kind of aware that the parrot could also just ring the bell because it would automatically bring their caregiver over to them to present the tablet. And, we all know having animals in our homes, they do enjoy often doing things with us. And so we wanted to train them to exactly know how to use the system. We train them to select between different parrots to recognize this. And so while this would have been really nice to be done on a more intuitive interface, because we were interested in this case in whether or not they would choose to use it, and we really wanted to make sure they understood their choice and preference in this case, we did do a lot of training here.
Did you get any specific feedback from the parrot owners about the engagement? Changes in behavior or how much they thought the animal enjoyed it?
So all caregivers that took part believed it was beneficial for themselves and their parrot. They said things to us during the interviews at the end, such as it increased their bonding with them and their parrot. And we see this a lot with animal training, that doing any sort of training with your pet or with your animal does increase the bond. We saw that they believe that they gave their parrots lots of autonomy, increased their trust in their bird. Part of, as I mentioned, was a lot of this training. So I think this really helped, really learning how to recognize, because we did so much training with the caregivers on recognizing any fear reactions or any sort of negative reaction to the video call to make sure that they could end it, to reduce any possible harm. That I think this really helped to really sort of understand their bird a bit more. And so all caregivers felt the system was beneficial. But this wasn't actually the case in the video study. When we switched the system to have video calls, a lot of the caregivers believed this wasn't beneficial, this system. They much preferred the live calls and the pre-recorded video systems. They felt it was just like their bird, they described it as their bird just watching TV and not really getting anything out of it.
Well, it seems like if the birds are very much interested in the calls but less interested in the videos, we're showing that this could be a social outlet for them, which contributes to well-being and all these sorts of things. How feasible is it for us to develop a parrot internet next?
I think it would be such a lovely step going forward. There's so much more questions I have around it. We need to do so much more studies in it, like we need with more birds as I mentioned, we did so much training around fear behavior that I'm really cautious about advising people just to stick a video call system in front of their parrot and straight away go ahead. We did a lot of things where we started off in the distance and slowly moved towards the bird. We had a parrot trainer involved. We did have people who dropped out of the study who weren't able to do the training, for instance, or didn't find it comfortable to do video calls. So it's not yet at the stage where I could just manually load this into an app and it would instantly roll out. There was a lot of, you see the videos and you're like, okay, I can do this at home. And there's a lot of work that really goes into this. It just needs more work around intuitive interfaces, as you mentioned. So maybe on less of the training, maybe to give them, because in our study, they had a choice between one or two of the birds. Maybe they need a larger circle. Who knows around this? There's so much different options that we can introduce before I think we start rolling it out into this.
I think you may have touched on some of the answers yet, but do you have any open research questions or thoughts on what to do next?
The things I would really like to look at next is about how does a parrot know that another parrot is live online? I would love to go deeper into this question in my research because in the moment we've measured a lot of the things around the parrots choosing to make a call and how long they stay in call. We've yet to start looking at the behavior side of things. So do parrots do mimicry of behavior? Does their parrots' online interactions mirror with their real interactions, mirror with their video interactions? This is a super complex question. And so I'd like to go further into how do parrots understand each other online and what does it mean to be a parrot online?
Well, I'm curious if you could share some thoughts on what you would measure in terms of engagement. Like the mimicry is a good one. If they start learning each other's calls, obviously that's a adaptation. But I'm also familiar with, and I'm sure you know about pinning, but for listeners who don't, it's a property of birds' eyes where they'll get the irises get real small and real big kind of fast, or at least in many species, and it's very much indicative of excitement and happiness to see someone and this sort of thing. Are there other behavioral cues like that you're interested in studying?
Vocalization, obviously, just because some not all parrots are vocal. I think people always think of parrots as having this huge repertoire of language, but not vocalization. We saw singing both towards videos and actually in live calls. So I'm interested in these sorts of singing behaviors, grooming behaviors, things that you would typically do as parrots when they are socially together. We also had sleeping behaviors. I'm interested as well on whether it's just because when you watch video, this could trigger a behavior. Does it need to also be done back, or is it just one way behavior that gives it away? Does the behavior need to be within a certain timeline? So when we talk, for instance, if we pause for too long, the other person immediately jumps in and we end up with this conversation where both people are talking. We have these inherent rules in our conversations that we pay attention to. So these sorts of things, I'm really going in with an open mind to looking at how parrots behave with each other currently towards how do these structure towards their video calls.
Well, I know I focused most of our conversation on the parrot angle, probably for my personal bias. Could you share some details about other species you study?
Originally, I did a lot of work with dogs. So how I got into this work was I got a black Labrador called Zach when I was quite young, when I was 21. And I was enjoying at this point in my life of doing my master's and studying, and Arduinos and microcontrollers were all coming in at this point. And I started to develop a lot of tech for him in our home. This is sort of how everything began. I had this crazy idea that I probably still have, that I believe that we could automate our house and our home to be both of us have autonomy and joint use and our technology over it. So I built stuff for him around screen systems so he can control essentially his own TV. Built video call systems for him, which led on to my parrot work. I've done more recently a lot of work with non-human primates, so with monkeys and with lemurs. This work really started out because I did some research with, as I mentioned, with my dog and looking at how he can control his own home when I'm not there, or together we can control it. And I started to see some parallels that this could really also benefit zoo animals, which often have very limited control over their own enclosure. They don't often choose when the lighting is there, when the heating is there, the audio, everything that we as humans enjoy and take advantage of, they often don't have access to. And so I started to do a lot of work around how do we build what we've been talking about, intuitive interfaces for. I started off with white-faced saki, which is about 30, 40, 50, 60 centimeters around monkey, very fluffy monkey. And I started to look at how can white-faced sakis control the audio in their enclosure. And then it's moved on to video and audio. And this then evolved into lemurs, looking at how lemurs can control their video in their enclosure. Audio in their enclosure. I've also done video. It's a little bit into the it's been 10 years now into this sort of research, so everything melds together a little bit. Also did some work on giraffes at some point. That was a bit of a sideline.
Most technology screens especially seem to be developed for humans or with humans in mind. Could you talk about the process of designing something for your use cases?
So a lot of times we start off really with the basic assumption that we ask people about, like the people in, as I mentioned before, the caregivers or the animals, whoever looks after the animals, we ask them questions about the animals, such as how do they interact in their everyday environment? Do they use their tongue? Do they use their hands? Do they use their neck, for instance? Various different body parts. We look a lot at the literature of how they behave in normal everyday environments. And then what we do is we start to try and build technology that fits in with this behavior. So with parrots, they lick things. This works in with when you talk about a screen interface, we need to then make the screen interface lickable. And then this is very different than lickable, as I mentioned, with humans, because we have this wet tongue. We have a much more dexterous tongue. Parrots, their tongues are designed for when they put a nut inside to be able to crack it. So they have a very different sorts of abilities with their tongues. I've designed interfaces for giraffes' tongues as well, and giraffe tongues are very different. They're hugely long, extremely textile, extremely strong. So even if you go into just a body part, this can massively vary across. And usually then we do a lot of testing on the interface. So if you took a screen interface in this case for a parrot, we do a lot of testing of getting parrots to touch and training them to touch the screen to see how the screen could be improved for a parrot's touch.
I'm sure there are learnings and then an evolution to how you build. Could you talk about that process?
So we do a lot of, in the same way as HCI, I do a lot of iterative design. I think it helps that I've been developing interfaces for like the last 10 years, that a lot of design knowledge now is carried on around stuff, but I do rely a lot on other people. But usually what happens is I do a lot of, depending on the animal. So if I work with an animal that this can't be done, but usually this is the preferred way, is to do a lot of low fidelity prototyping. Very, very low fidelity in the beginning. Usually I build stuff. You see a lot of ice cream boxes actually in my work just because they're very stable and they can hold things and you can cut holes in them very easily. We do a lot of testing where we try and also augment the animals' toys they already use, because a lot of these are already fit for purpose, especially if we have an animal which is kind of strong. So we talk about a giraffe, which can have quite a hit with their neck. We started off with using their toys in this interface. When we did a lot of prototyping with white-faced sakis originally, we did a lot of laser cutting, which was excellent at the time because we can quickly form different shapes. We were looking at how do we develop buttons for them, and we would test all different sorts of interfaces by just quickly laser cutting them and painting them different colors, and we could just go inside their enclosure and test it with them in this way. And this really avoids the problem of, because it does take so much time to make a device that's animal proof, and also a lot of expense of developing it. It just reduces, in the same way HCI uses this low fidelity prototyping, reduces all these problems. But it doesn't always guarantee there's an interaction. I've spent, before the button interface I made for white-faced saki monkeys, we did so much testing around the ergonomics of the hands, how heavy something needs to be. We found they didn't like push interfaces. They didn't like, for instance, they don't push in the same way that we would push buttons. They much prefer a pull interface. They also like interfaces which slide, so they can slide something along. But then when you make something pull interfaces, it causes a bit of frustration because they want to take it away. So we ended up with a slide interface. And then we built this into this big tunnel device where they could then slide these different, buttons along, and it would play them different audio. And they just completely ignored it. So as soon as we put it in. And so low fidelity prototyping in many ways offers animals the ability to try it, especially getting rid of our assumptions. We always assume animals are going to use something in a certain way, or we imagine it in a certain way. So it gets rid of a lot of our biases, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee an interactive interface.
Well, there's some parallels between the parrot work and some of your work with dogs. Could you expand on some of the studies you did with dogs?
My most recent work on dogs was I was really starting to look at sort of how do we make the animal internet. So what happened was I'd been building all this stuff for my dog, what I mentioned before about these screen interfaces, so a dog could control what they wanted to watch on the screen. I was seeing whether they could look between multiple screens, all these different sorts of things. And then I moved abroad for my postdoc. So after I finished my PhD study, my dog has actually grown up a lot with my dad's dog, who is also another Labrador, and they get on really well. And we were doing things like we were mailing fur across to each other and having video calls. I started to wonder if there was technology that could connect them together in a more better way. And so I wrote a paper around, I think it's called like No One Knows You're a Dog on the Internet Unless You're Another Dog, talking about how two dogs could potentially interact on the internet. So it was things like maybe they could play tug of war, and do dogs recognize each other's tugging behaviors, for instance. Dogs often, when they run together, they do things called referential gazing, which is where they look at each other as they run. So you'll see this a lot of the time. And this is forms an important part of their play behaviors. So maybe we could make like a referential gazing device where they run and look at each other. Maybe we can make a collar device that allows them to sort of find each other. I imagined all these sorts of futures of the animal internet, and then I thought, okay, Ilyena, like part of what you do is build a lot of these prototypes and these ideas. And someone said to me, you should just start building this. And I was like, oh, how do I even begin? And so I thought I'd take a step back. And this is when I went and built the dog phone, which was a device I developed for my dog to video call me. You can do a lot of understanding around the human aspect, but it's really unknown aspect around the pet. So I thought at least I would understand one side of the interaction.
Could you share some details on these dog calls? Obviously, they didn't necessarily whistle or pin at each other. What were some of the behaviors you observed in this use case?
My dog would be able to video call me, and I was able to video call my dog. I developed a system. We did a lot of this low fidelity prototyping. So I tested out sticks, I tested out different toys, different balls, different sort of devices. He's a Labrador, so he carries things on his mouth. They ended up building him this green and white ball device, which had inside of it a tiny, tiny microcontroller that would recognize his carrying behaviors. So when he carried the device, it would recognize this and do a video call to a screen that was in my house. And I would give him this device whenever I was gone from the house, and I would try and pick up his video calls. He did a lot of video calls, actually, more than I expected in there, which became, I tried to pick up every single call and help him establish that when he plays with the ball, something happens. This was a bit awkward in work. Sometimes I'm just constantly picking up these calls. And also sometimes I was in the middle of doing something and I would pick up the call and just say, okay, Zach, like, I'm doing stuff. He would do various different sorts of behaviors in the call. So sometimes he'd just be running around the house with the ball. Sometimes he would bring me other toys, and there was a case where he would throw a toy at the laptop, for instance. And I was like, I can't play. I don't know what you're trying to do remotely. We did a lot of early prototyping because he would often sleep with the ball, and it would recognize him sort of moving around in his sleep. So we had to get rid of that behavior. He's a big dreamer. So yeah, we had just various different sorts of behaviors in the call. It did cause me a little bit of worry, some of the calls, which is actually why we stopped using the system. Just because he would normally call me about mid-morning and then around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And there was a couple of days where he didn't call me, and I start thinking, oh, why have I not received a video call yet? Or what's going on? And because it was a system that I created, I could backdoor log in and I could view into my house into it. And sometimes I didn't see him, and it's just because he was sleeping elsewhere. But then you get these worries that you always get with pets of, are they okay? Or where are they? Or what's going on? In the end, I didn't feel really that I was getting the full benefit of the system.
So you've got that microcontroller in the ball that's giving you some sorts of sensors in there. Could you share some details on the engineering challenges of recognizing the difference between carrying the ball and engaging with it versus sleeping with it and it just getting nudged around?
Yeah, a lot of a lot of challenges. Originally, we just developed it to recognize any movement, and then this what we did is I would just test this in the house with him, and then see what sort of movements he would do. There's challenges around micro movements, so you can get like, because I didn't fix it to enable it to be charged. I didn't fix it actually. It was a soft ball with a tennis ball on the inside, and then I sort of cut open the tennis ball and just shoved it inside of that. We just kept upping and upping the threshold into requiring the sweet point of him moving it and him doing the tiny, tiny dreaming behaviors. Or he would sometimes leave it on a carpet and then run across the carpet, and that would move it slightly. So that was another thing that would trigger it off. I tried to keep it sensitive enough that if he leant on it and moved it, I tried to keep in this movement actually, because he would use this a lot. We think of animals sometimes as using technology through deliberate and huge, like as we would think, interactions of picking up and putting down. But he would often do this leaning and sitting on it behavior as well. So I tried to, rather than just do it these big, large sort of movements, tried to keep this sensitive ones in there for this, but just at a threshold enough that when he was dreaming, doing these tiny movements or running across the carpet or it just moving slightly inside of it, or when he placed it rolling a little bit, it wouldn't pick up.
Did you consider using machine learning as a solution for that?
Oh, I'm not a machine learning person. My background is a lot in interaction design, but it could be machine learning, right? This is quite a possibility of it, especially with the advances that have come recently in machine learning. But I'm also always aware of just saying, okay, machine learning is like a plaster that we just apply to everything nowadays. So we do have technology that tries to measure dogs' movements. So you get things like the Fitbark. I'm not sure if you're aware of this. It's like a device that you put on the collar. It looks like a little bone, and it measures activity points. And you do get stuff for dogs that measures steps they take, but often these are so inaccurate. And there's a lot of research done on the ability to be able to actively recognize dogs from these monitors in there that is not so good, but maybe it will get better in the future. But I know there's a lot of machine learning around dog behaviors that's increasing the more we learn about machine learning and the more accurate we get around skeletal, or there's other machine learning that just look at the image, for instance, and things like this.
Well, I think there's a tremendous value in your research from purely a basic scientific point of view. We're learning things, we're getting insights. Is there also a value in terms of animal welfare that you think you can unlock?
Yeah, I hope so. We never really know, right? We can't say, as you mentioned at the start, I can't really go to an animal and say, rate me out of 5 stars on if I benefit your life. We rely a lot on caregivers to do this, and we also rely a lot on animal behaviors. So I mentioned with parrots, the next step is to really look at behaviors and how does this work. I think this will be a step towards unlocking it. With monkeys previously, we've seen that our technology helps reduce scratching behaviors, which can be seen as a negative behavior. But like that example shows, I say can be seen as because we don't really know if all behavior doesn't necessarily correlate towards emotion or how we feel with things. So I really try and develop my technology in a way that gives animals choice and more autonomy over their lives, which I believe, and a lot of research shows that it does benefit their welfare, having these choices and having this autonomy. There was a great research paper that showed that monkeys, for instance, will turn on and off a light if it's available just because they have a choice, not necessarily because they want the light on and off. So this gives you an idea around how much choice can influence an interaction to be beneficial. So I hope my technology can, but I think we're in so many ways locked out of the real true feelings of how animals find this technology, which is why I develop it to animals to be able to choose to use or not.
The reduction of scratching in chimps sounds like a positive indicator. What was the technology available that got them so interested and so less interested, that I guess, in scratching?
It was with not with chimps. It was with the technology we developed. There was audio technology with white-faced Saki monkeys. We developed a tunnel-like device, and we developed it so it was see-through at the top because Saki monkeys don't like to feel enclosed. And we developed it with Raspberry Pi in the side, so we could just basically IoT device, so we could place it high up inside their enclosure because Saki monkeys typically like to be high up in the jungle. We developed this technology that when they went inside of the device, it would play them different audio. And the audio could only be heard inside of the device. So typically, when you would measure animals' reactions to audios, you would just blast it inside their enclosure. All animals don't have control over it, and then you just measure their behavior to the audio and not to different audio. And so I wanted to instead look at animals' reactions to audio in a way that gave them the choice over whether to listen or not to go inside. And then if they chose to listen or not to the audio, it only affected those who chose to go inside the tunnel because multiple of them could fit inside at once. We then looked at their behaviors to these different sort of audio. I believe it's it. We did like 2 studies very similar in a row, so I really hope it is the right study.
I think so. There's also the chimp study with synthesizing music that was fascinating. I think maybe that's the similar one you're thinking of.
No, I never did chimps with synthesizing music. That's not my work. I would love to do ones around chimps and music, but I've all of my stuff with chimps is currently unpublished. But maybe you know about it. I don't know.
Oh no, the interactive design paper has at least a sketch. Maybe you didn't build it, but a sketch for a music
Oh
player for
yeah,
chimps. Yeah.
I have made music players for chimps. Recently, we've been working a lot on also video players for chimps and also video callers for chimps in the same way. Chimps are such a hard design problem because you can't low fidelity prototype with them. They will just break anything.
Ah,
You give them everything needs to be concreted or
worse than parrots. Interesting.
yeah. Yeah. Worse, not worse or best. It's very different. It's different design problem. With chimps, we started out in the drawings. What we do initially is to make sure we're all on the same page because you have so many moving parts with when you work with the zoo. You have the keeper, you have the head of research, you have our ideas, and so we do a lot of sketching initially to see and show them to see is this is what we're thinking. What do you think of this? And it helps put ideas concretely down. So they'll say, okay, I like this aspect of this sketch of technology or this, or, I don't like this for this reason. And so we do a lot of sketching initially, which means, unfortunately, a lot of my poor publications a lot of my poorly drawn sketches are in my publications. It's okay. It's a lot of my students sketching as well. I think that one is my student's one. The one in there that's a draft that's unfortunately is mine. But the student there was interested, in looking at chimps and audio. And so we ended up building a device where three chimpanzees could trigger audio in their enclosure by approaching and standing in front of a device.
Do you see an opportunity for doing some citizen science or crowdsourcing?
Yeah, I think for sure. If you follow me on Twitter and stuff, I usually advertise when I'm looking for. I do plan in the future to do some work around sort of how parrots use interfaces and how people can use these at homes. I'm always very interested in supporting animals where they are, which is why I do so much work with animals in their homes and in the zoos. So yeah, I see really great opportunities here. It's just at the moment, because we're so new into it, it's been a lot more of sort of rigorous studies in this.
And what's next for you in your work?
So, for the next things in my work, I would really like to start looking at the deeper questions. So, for instance, with the parrot stuff, how does a parrot know another parrot's online? For instance, looking at their behaviors and synchronicity. I'm interested in applying sort of video calls and how video calls affect animals' social interactions to other animals, such as animals kept in zoos that in the wild, for instance, chimpanzees in the wild would live in huge groups. But in the zoos, they often only live in smaller groups. I can see a great need for video callers and looking at how this applies across species here. In the future, I would also really like to look at how we can give animals more choices over their home environments, such as heating, lighting, audio, visual, and everything that we take for advantage for us. I would really like to do this more for animals and really see how this benefits them, if this benefits them, and how we can make interfaces that work for them in the same way we have interfaces that work for us.
And is there anywhere listeners can follow you online?
Yeah, so I post on Twitter a lot. You're supposed to call it X, I don't know. I post there anyway. You can follow me online on Twitter or X at Ilyena. And then, of course, all my stuff is sort of freely available on my website as well, like ilyena.com.
Very cool. We'll have links in the show notes for listeners to follow up. Ilyena, thank you so much for taking the time to come on and share your work.
Thank you for having me and for your insightful questions. I really appreciate it.